Before we get started, let's take a step back and make sure we're all on the same page and have a firm understanding of what GraphQL is and what it is helping us to achieve. GraphQL is a query language for your API. GraphQL gives us server-side runtime for executing queries with a type system we define for our data. GraphQL isn't tied to any specific database or storage engine, and it is instead backed by your existing code and data. GraphQL provides a complete and easy-to-understand description of the data in your API, giving clients the power to ask for exactly what they need and nothing more. This helps us evolve our API simply and effectively as our application grows. GraphQL has brought us a revolutionary new way to think about APIs. Instead of working with rigid server-defined endpoints, we can send queries to get exactly the data we're looking for, returned back in exactly the shape we're expecting, all within one request. Don't worry, we'll dive into more about what this means exactly later in this course. GraphQL can be very beneficial when adopted in an organization, enabling front-end and back-end teams to collaborate smoother than ever before. Both GraphQL and REST APIs involve sending a request and receiving a result, but the way they accomplish the same goal is very different. There are, of course, similarities between the two, as GraphQL conceptually may feel familiar to you if you've built REST APIs before. So let's dive into some of these similarities and differences between these two API paradigms. In REST API, each resource is identified by a URL, and you retrieve that resource by sending an HTTP request to that URL with a variety of different HTTP verbs. The shape and size of the resource returned to the client is typically determined by the server. The server receives the request and retrieves the HTTP verb and the URL path. Let's imagine we have a GET request coming into the URL/coffees, which by standard practice should retrieve us all of the coffees in whatever shape the server decides to send back to us. By default, the user can't control what is returned back to them unless we had set up that type of logic in the API ourselves. For other types of operations, we have other corresponding HTTP verbs as well. For example, we use post for creating a resource and delete for removing it. The API library or framework matches up the verb and path to a function registered by the server code. Afterwards, the function executes once and returns the expected result. If you've worked with REST APIs before, this should all sound familiar so far. On the other hand, in GraphQL, we don't use URLs to identify what is available from the API. Instead, we use what is known as a GraphQL schema, which describes all of the functionality available to the client applications that connect to our GraphQL server. This schema is essentially a representation of the types, queries, mutations, required fields, and absolutely everything else about the structure of our API. One of the many unique things about GraphQL APIs is that in GraphQL, everything comes from a single request endpoint. One other main differentiator with GraphQL is that the consumer can define what it wants to retrieve. So let's imagine the user wants to retrieve all coffees, but only wants to retrieve the ID and name properties back with each coffee. With GraphQL, achieving this is effortless. As we can see, GraphQL allows consumers to get exactly what they need, nothing more and nothing less. Instead of sending a different HTTP verb to the same URL to differentiate the type of request we want to make, be it a read, a write, etc., GraphQL uses types called query for read operations and mutation for write operations. There is also a third GraphQL operation known as a subscription, but we'll be diving into that later in this course. When making a GraphQL request, we can select which type of operation we wish to send with just a keyword, query or mutation. In the previous example, we actually used the shorthand syntax where we omitted the query keyword. The operation type, be it query, mutation, or subscription, is required unless you're using the query shorthand syntax. If this doesn't make sense yet, don't worry, we'll be diving into all of this in a few moments. The important thing to remember here is that at the end of the day, both REST and GraphQL APIs are just fancy ways to send and retrieve data that ends up calling functions over a network. Essentially, you can think of GraphQL as a system for calling many nested endpoints in one request, almost like a multiplexed REST API. If you're interested in more about the general nature of GraphQL itself, Be sure to check out graphql.org for more great information.